This is Arya, and this is just a simple fluid simulation, but what helps sell it is the audio. And creating audio for my work is one of my favorite things to do because it helps tell the story of the scene. So today we're going to quickly create this simulation, and then I just want to give you some ideas on how to create, as well as some places where you can find some sound effects for free that you can use for any purpose. I've also decided to start creating sound packs that will be available for those of you who subscribe to my Patreon page, alongside of access to the blend files for each of my original animations. Okay, here we go. Because we are a bit more focused on audio for this, we're going to go through this fairly quickly, so hit A to select everything and then hit delete. Shift A, mesh, and let's add a cylinder, and then we want to turn this into our water container. I'm going to scale this on the X and Y by hitting S, then Shift Z, and typing in 1.4. Let's also make this a bit of an oval shape, so S to scale again, hit the X key to lock just to the X axis, and then type in 1.25. Finally, we can scale this down on the Z, so S one more time to scale, Z, and then type in 0.5. We can hit tab to go into edit mode, or you can just click up here as well. Then we just want to make a bit of a bowl shape, so what we're going to do is make sure that you're in vertex or edge select mode, and then you can hold Alt and click to select this entire loop. Hit I to inset, and then we can just drag this in so that there's a little bit of a lip. Now while we've got this selected, we can hit E to extrude and just drag this down a little bit. And then click again. We need to extrude again, so let's hit E, and then right away we want to hit escape. Then just so that we can see what we're doing, I'm just going to click up here on the X-ray toggle. Then if I hit S and just drag this out, you can see that our faces are underneath. So we just want to make this a little bit wider, but if I go into top orthographic by hitting 7, you just want to make sure that you only go about halfway. Then finally, now that we've got that, we can hit E one more time and just drag our mouse all the way down. Then now if I just go into right orthographic, you should have something that looks roughly like this. Just to make it less confusing, just turn off the X-ray toggle and you can sort of see the outline of our object here. Stay in edit mode, but I'm just going to show you that, of course, if I go to the modifiers here and add a subdivision surface, it's going to completely destroy this. So what we need to do is add some extra loop cuts to support our geometry. So let's just keep this simple and add one beside all of our edges. So hold Control, hit R, and then click. Then we want to do this for the top as well. So Control R and add a loop cut to both the front and the back. Then let's do it inside here. So Control R, top and bottom. If I just click one of these vertices here and hit the decimal key to zoom in, you'll see that now we can sort of look underneath here, and we do need to add loop cuts to this as well, so Control R to add to there as well. Then let's add one inside here and as well at the bottom. And then the last thing we need to do is add some geometry to the bottom, so Alt and click this to select this edge loop. Hit I. Just drag your mouse in and we'll just do that a few times. We also want to do it to the inside face as well, so let's Alt select this loop here and do the same thing, I, and let's just drag our mouse in. And you can do this a few times. Now we can hit tab to go back into object mode, right click and shade smooth. Now if we head over to the modifiers tab and click here, we can add a subdivision surface and set this to 2. I'm also going to just bring this up so that it's level with the ground, so GZ and type in 0.5. Next we need to create an object for our liquid, so Shift A, Mesh, Cylinder. I'm just going to hit 7 to go into top orthographic, turn on my X-ray toggle, S to scale, and I'm just going to drag this out. And then you want to go somewhere in between these two lines. Then we can do the same thing on the X, so S to scale, X, and we'll just drag this out until it's somewhere close to the inner edge. Go into one of your orthographic views. I'm just going to bring the cylinder up, so GZ, and put the pivot point somewhere in the center of this. Then S to scale, Z, and just drag this down until it fits. You can spend a little bit of time with this, but just make sure that there's a little bit of a border all the way around. And then that's it for our liquid. So now finally we can add our domain, Shift A, Mesh, and Cube. Then hit S and 3 to scale this up. Now we just want to hit G and Z to bring this up. And you can scale this down a little bit on the X and Y if you want, just don't go too far. And as well, do it from the side just so that you're not cutting off any of the liquid. So S, Shift Z, and you can just drag this in a little bit. Awesome, so now that we've got our pieces, if I hit N, you'll notice that we haven't applied our scale values, so let's do that for all of our objects. So select the domain, Shift A, and select scale. Then we can do that with the bolt as well, and for the liquid. By the way, just so that we don't get confused, let's just rename these. I also like to put on the restriction toggles here because we will be using them at some point, so click here and add those. Now that we've got most of our objects here, we can start adding our physics. So let's head over to the physics by clicking here. And then you can do these in whatever order you want. Since we're on frame 44, nothing will get activated until we go to frame 1, so it doesn't matter. But I'm just going to start with the liquid. Let's head over to the physics and click fluid. And then for the type, we're going to select flow. Obviously, we don't want this to be smoke, so let's click here and set this to liquid. Everything else can be the same. This is just whether or not we want this to continually flow or just be like a body of water. So if we use geometry, it will just create liquid one time within that boundary, instead of having it flow out like a tap. Next, we can select our container, select fluid, and for this one, we're going to click on effector. Then we can leave the substeps alone for now since it's just going to be sitting in one place, but if you do have a moving object, you can add substeps, which will just help it to calculate better. Then you won't need to do this for every simulation, but it's always a good idea to add some surface thickness, just so that the fluid doesn't crash through. So in this case, I'm going to go all the way up to 0.8, but since we've got an enclosed fluid here, you won't really notice the little border. So if you are getting some leaking, make sure to add some thickness. As well, always make sure to apply your scale. Now we can select our domain, fluid. Then let's set the type to domain, domain type to liquid. And then I'm going to set my divisions to around 100. For my final animation, I had this quite a bit higher, but 100 should work fine. And now we can just scroll down. Leave all of these settings to default. Let's add some diffusion. And we can just leave this to default. Finally, what we need to do is add a mesh, so let's click mesh to turn it on. And again, we can just leave this at default. What this will do is as soon as we go to frame 1, our domain will take the shape of our fluid geometry. Sometimes with fluid simulations, you need to sort of reset things, so what I do is I just always hit replay once I've added something new, and that way everything will be refreshed. It can get quite annoying to scroll all the way up and down, so what I do is if you put your mouse down here, you can see this little plus symbol, click and drag. Then I'm just going to scroll all the way up to the top, and you'll see this little pin icon, so just select that. Then if you scroll all the way back down to the cache settings, you'll always have these accessible, so even if you click away, you'll still have these here, which I just find handy because I'm always clicking replay to reset the simulation. So that's it. So what we can do to activate our simulation is just click here to go back to frame 1. Then after a few seconds, your liquid should pop up. Right click and shade smooth. But just keep in mind that if you've got a slower system and you hit play to sort of preview this, you can freeze your system. So I'm just going to show you some things that you can run into. So if I hit play, you'll see right away that my liquid is just falling straight through. So even though we've set up everything correctly, it still wants to crash through. So I'm just going to show you a couple of the tricks that I do to sort of fix that, because it should calculate properly. So the first thing that you can do is try to change the resolution. So just a little bit higher, say 102. And right away you'll see that it's already looking a lot better, and if I was to hit play, you'll see that everything is locked in place. Now if I go back to frame 1 and put this back down to 100, and then hit play one more time, you can see now that it's fixed. So if this is happening to you, it's not necessarily something that you've missed. It could just be Blender not calculating correctly. So if that does happen, the first thing I like to do is change my resolution. Speaking of which, it looked a little bit better at 102, so I'm just going to switch that back. Awesome, so now that we got that, we can add the sphere for our waves. So Shift A and let's click UV sphere. Then I'm just going to bring this up a little bit. Hit S to scale and type in 0.25. I also don't want this to be a perfect circle, so I'm going to hit S to scale, Shift Z, and type in 1.3. Again, since we changed the size of this, we do want to apply our scale, so Control A and click Scale. To get that up and down motion, we can just go to the graph editor. So up here on the left, let's get the little plus symbol. Click and drag to split the window. Then select here and go to the graph editor. There is no information, so what we can do is again make sure you're on frame 1. Select the sphere, hit I, and add a location keyframe. Now we can open up this and we've got our location toggles. Hit normalize just so that everything's together. Select the Z location, then hover in this window and hit N, modifiers. And we want to add a cycles modifier, but we need to create some keyframes first. So let's head to about frame 15 or something like that. Hit G and Z, and then we just want to bring this down so that it's sort of submerged in our liquid. Once we've got that, we can head up to the transform settings here. Right click and insert a single keyframe. So now that we've got our low keyframe, let's just head back to frame 1, and now we can set how high this thing is going to go up. So hit G and Z, and I just want to bring this up just a little bit, and that should work great. So up to the top, right click and replace keyframes. We don't need these 2 keyframes, so if you want, you can clear these keyframes. Then once you've got that, you can either click and copy this value, or you can just select this keyframe and hit Ctrl C, head to frame 30, then hit Ctrl V, or you can also just paste the value here. Now finally, if we go back into the graph editor, click here and click cycles, you'll see that it creates an infinite loop of our keyframes. That's all we need this for, so I'm going to right click and just join this and close that window. Okay, so I just want to test the speed of this, so what we can do is just head up here, and now that we've got these other toggles on, if we just click the center toggle on the domain, you'll see that the liquid goes away, and this will just speed up the viewport just so that we can see how quick this is going. What you can do is just hover over the timeline, hit A to select all the keyframes. Then if you hit G, you can just drag this over. I'm just going to drag this over till it's just before it touches the liquid. And that's about a good enough speed for me, but if you do want to make this slower, make sure you're on frame 1, hit S to scale, and you can just drag this out, which will just make your animation slower or faster. By the way, if it's not as high as you thought it would be, what you can do is just go to those keyframes and maybe bring this up a little bit higher, but you just want to make sure that you change it to both of the keyframes. So I'm going to select here and Control Copy to copy this value. You can just click this button 2 times to go back to the other keyframe, which is our height, and then Control V to paste and replace the keyframe. So now we can turn our liquid back on, and I'm just going to turn this off in both the viewport and the render, and this is just our original geometry for our liquid, but we don't need this to be visible anymore. Just make sure to leave this middle one on so that it can calculate as part of our simulation. And now we can select our sphere, head over to the right and into the physics properties, click fluid, and then select effector. Because this is moving, I'm just going to add a couple of substeps, but you don't need to do this. Because we added something new to our simulation, I'm just going to head down to the replay and reactivate that. And right away you'll see again that we're having issues, so I'm just going to select the domain and just add a different amount of resolution. Then just set it back, and again you'll see that this just happens sometimes with blenders, so don't freak out, don't panic. Always try to find a way to reset the simulation by either clicking replay or just re-entering or changing the value of the resolution. Then now if I hit play, you can see that we've got our interaction with our object. I also added a force to mine just to get a little bit more push against the water, so back to frame 1, Shift A, force field, and let's select force. We just want to bring this up so that it's next to our sphere. By the way, when we do that, that will happen, so you can just add the X-ray or hide the domain for a sec. Put that in the center, Then while it's selected, Shift select the sphere, Control P, and select Object so that it follows our sphere. So now we can select our force. Let's change the strength to 2 and the flow to 1. Then since we don't want this to affect the entire simulation, we can just head down to the bottom and add a minimum and maximum distance. Let's set this to something like 0.42 and this one to 0.45. That's a little bit bigger than our sphere, so let's just grab our sphere. I'm just going to hit S. So I'll just quickly hide the domain, hit S, and just scale this out to something like that. Then unhide the domain. If I hit play, you can see that it gives it a little bit more of a push now. By the way, if you are trying to get those finer details, you will need to add some more resolution, so you could just add resolution here. So by all means, you can keep this low, but I'm going to set mine to 128 just so that it's a little bit more defined. So now if I hit play, you can see that there's a lot more detail here, and you get these sort of finer details that you didn't get with the lower resolution. And then once we're done that, we can quickly add the rest of our scene and talk about audio. Once you've got your final simulation, just head down here, or just all the way down in the physics properties of the domain. Select replay, and then you want to select all or final, whichever version you're using, and then hit bake. And now you can either just hit play, or you can just scrub through your timeline to see your final simulation. So now we can move on to lighting and materials. So I'm just going to pick a random frame. Then up at the top, we can click here to go into the shading tab. Once we're in here, let's just head up to the right and turn on our render preview. Normally we would add an HDRI, but today we're going to be using a giant wall of light. So what we can do is just leave this at default, but we do want to up the value a little bit. So let's add our ground plane, Shift A and Mesh, S to scale, and type in 10. Shift A again, Mesh plane. Then let's rotate this, so R to rotate, Y, and type in 90. S to scale and type in 10. Then again G, X, and we'll just bring this back. Let's click New, delete the principled shader, and then we're going to search for an emission shader. Give this a slightly blue color and set the strength to 11. Now we can select our ground plane, add a new material, and then we're just going to select the base color. Click on this value and type in 1.25 to make it a little bit brighter, and then we'll just bring the roughness down to something like 0.3. So now that we're at this point, I'm going to switch over to cycles, but if you do want to stick with Eevee, just make sure that you head into the rendering properties and add things like ambient occlusion, bloom, and screen space reflections. I'm going to select the liquid next, then click New to add a new shader. Give this a slightly blue tone, and then set the value to 2. Add a little bit of metallic, something like 0.075. Roughness again to something around 0.3, and then set the transmission to 0.2. Shift A and search for bump. Set the strength to 0.1, then hook the normal into the normal. Shift A and search for Musgrave, then we can just take the height and hook it into the height. Set the scale to 25, the detail to 25, and the dimension to 5. And this just gives it a little bit more detail. Next, we can select the bowl, add a new material. Click here and set the value to 2 so that it's a lot brighter, and the roughness down to 0.3. Shift A, search for bump, and set the strength to 0.25. Then search for Voronoi, and let's hook the distance into the height. Select this second slot here and select distance to edge. Then we can scale this to 50 and set the randomness to 0.1. That's looking good, but I don't like the way this looks on the top here, so what we can do is just add a different material there. So let's just quickly go into flat shading and hit tab to go into edit mode. Select all of these top faces. Head over to the materials properties here. Then you can click the plus to select a new material. Click assign to assign those faces, and then click new. You'll see that we got a different material up top, so let's just make that a little bit brighter. Next, let's select our sphere and click New. Roughness down to 0.3. And as well, we want to bring the transmission up almost to halfway. Then one more time, let's search for bump. normal into the normal, and we'll set this to 0.2. Shift A again and search for Musgrave. Hook this up, and then we'll just set these all to 5, which will just give us a little bit of variation on our surface. So let's just head back to the Layout tab just so that we got a little bit more room and activate our render preview. Then Shift A, Camera, and Control Alt and 0 to set this up, and now we just want to set our camera up. Then we can just quickly add those spheres. The final thing I added was a stem to mine, which is just a simple cylinder. And that's our final image. So usually at this point I say goodbye, but what I want to do is just quickly run through kind of what I do after I've rendered out my animation. By the way, if you are rendering out an animation, make sure to come over here and select a folder. Then you can render out a video, but a much safer way would be to render out something like Targers or JPEG, and you can just put them together in an editing program. So a lot of people have asked me how I create my sound effects and where they come from. I do have a few go-to places that I like to search, and I also create my own sounds. So the first place that I do want to show you, just because it's the simplest, is called freesound.org. And this is actually the very first place that I came to when I was looking for audio. So just make sure to register a free account, and then for example is if you type in something like water drop, you can see that we've got about 1,500 different sounds that we can choose from. So just a couple things to keep in mind. The very first thing you want to look at is right here. And this basically just tells you what the license is. So this one here is Creative Commons Attribution. So what you could do is if you just open this in a new window, you'll see that you could select this here and it tells you what it is. So if I go to that, it tells you exactly what you're able to do. So you can do this here. This artist does want to get credit for it. The next one here is a little bit different, and this is mainly the one that you want to look for, and you can see that this is public domain. And you'll see that if we click here, there is 0 copyright, so there's nothing involved here. You can do whatever you want. You could even sell this. As well, if you do have a YouTube account, you can go into the YouTube studio, and there's an audio library at the bottom here. You've got music and different sound effects, and if I was to just scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can click on the terms and conditions, and you'll see that this is a little bit different. So if you are using the YouTube audio, you have to make sure that you're not redistributing this or selling this or anything like that. But again, the idea here is to sort of use these for your YouTube videos. And then if you just do a random Google search, you'll find places like this, for example, that you can just immediately download their audio by clicking here. And if you just scroll down, you'll see here that you can use these sound effects for all of these purposes here. So one thing I like to do when I do find a new site is just to make sure that you know what their terms and conditions are. Like for example, if you click this license and go to the sound effects free license, this will tell you exactly what you can do, so you can add this to everything. And like I said, before you start downloading sounds, this is a good thing to do just so that you know you're not going to get a whole bunch of sounds and realize that you have to pay for them. Or you might find out that you can't use them commercially or something like that. So finally, the last thing I do is create my own sounds, so you can create really good audio. For example, the audio from this video is 100% created by myself. I know it's pretty basic, but it just gives you an idea of how fast you can do that. And all I really did was took a bowl, filled it with water, and used some different items to make some splashing sounds. Then once you've got all of your sounds, you can pretty much head into any editing program. I like to use DaVinci Resolve. All I do is drag the folder with all my files in for my animation, and simply start placing sounds underneath. I always like to have some sort of bass track at the bottom that sort of carries the whole thing, just so that you don't get dead silence. Of course, as well, you can also do this in Blender. And a super quick way to do that is if you just go up to File, New, and click Video Editing. This will just give you a little bit of a template. Then again, you can start dragging in your video and audio in here and start moving it in place. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye.